Hi everyone, welcome to our show, The View from the Corners Office. In today's episode, we have the chair of EY Foundation, a charity of Ernst & Young. Along with this, he is also part of many other businesses and social enterprises as their board member. Please welcome Patrick Dunne. Thank you for joining us today, Patrick.
Absolutely my pleasure, Gunujan.
So let me begin by asking you, can you talk more about your childhood?
Oh, yes. Well, it's a while ago, but I was born in a place called Toxters in Liverpool, which was, at the time I was born was a pretty challenged place. My family was Irish. They literally came over on the boat. So we were kind of immigrants at the time. And I had the most amazing mum who, although wasn't highly educated, was very bright and had great values. And she instilled in me a lot of things. I had to work very hard. I'm mildly dyslexic, so that's challenging. I was pretty good at football and pretty good at maths, but not much good at everything else. So I struggled a bit at school, but because of my maths, I ended up getting to Warwick University to do maths and statistics.
Oh, that's fabulous. And what key values, because you talked about your childhood having a slight dyslexia. So what key values would you say contributed to having this current persona? You are not just a chair in EY Foundation, which like we have said, but you have chair and board member and trustee for various other organizations supporting business and social.
Me and just because this was pre-internet and we needed money, so I had to work from a very young age. I would just knock on doors of shops, of businesses, just to get some work. And of course, 99% at that time of those knocks resulted in nothing. Some abuse, some challenge, and so I got pretty good at dealing with rejection, which I think is a great, that resilience that you get from that. And also got used to working very hard, trying to get through school and have various jobs. It was tough, but I had a goal, I had the drive, and I had the example of my mum to sort of keep me going.
Okay, so you would say your mum and her guidance played a key role in what you are today.
Oh, completely. And one thing that always drove me on was because expectations of people like me were so low. Most people in my street didn't have a job, high unemployment, low educational achievement. What spurred me on a lot was every time I got something happen that was good, particularly around my maths or whatever that might be, I always thought, well, imagine what I can do now. And I used to look up as a child at these planes flying over Liverpool across the Atlantic. And I said, one day, maybe, if I work hard enough, I'll be on one of those planes. So I had these, you had to do a lot of self-motivation if you live in a place like that. And those of you that come from places like that will know how that feels like. It's wonderful in hindsight, but it's incredibly hard at the time.
Yes, and I think that brings me to a question which talks about your interest for board. You have authored 4 books around boards, and why is there so much interest? You have been in so many companies, board of directors and chairs. So what interests you so much?
So my first job was in the chemicals industry in air products, and I was incredibly lucky because I was a mathematician working on kind of business maths, if you like. I had a lot of interaction with the board very early on, straight from graduating. Then I did an MBA and got into private equity. And very early in my job, I realized that the better the board we had, the more money we made. And the better the board we had, the less hassle we had, the less downside we had. So I got very interested in, well, what makes a good board? What makes a good board member? What makes good board members work well? together. And as 3i internationalized, and we were growing across the world, I started to get very interested in the cultural differences around boards, and those sort of things. So although I ended up being on the operating committee of 3i and doing big group roles, I always kept this kind of board fixing, board kind of whispering kind of side to my job. So I'm just, it's fascinating when you can get a group of people and that board can work, really well with the executive team, what you can achieve. And equally, it's immensely frustrating if you've got a group of people who individually may be talented, but they're just not working well together, either as a board or as a board and an exec grouping.
On that, any memorable instance during one of your board meeting that you would like to share with the audience?
Oh, where do I start? So one of the things I've always been interested in as well, I mean, I guess it may also be rooted in where I came from, is managing conflict. And in fact, one of the social enterprises I helped to build was Confronting Conflict, which deals with conflict. So often my favorite moments have been very uncomfortable moments on a board. And one of the things my Irish gran taught me as a child was that it's really important to listen to what people think as much as what they say. And you then ask the question, well, how do I know what people think? And what's really interesting is if you watch, you observe, if you look at that face and you look at the changes in the face and you look at the body language, you can tell whether people are uncomfortable. And so often my favorite moments on boards have been where, maybe the CEO is going a bit too far, the CFO is uncomfortable with it. And I just look at the CFO in the eye and they feel compelled to speak. And then you get a moderation as a result. And I love those kind of moments. I spend quite a bit of time advising boards these days as well as being on them. And I love resolving conflicts. Conflict, a lot of people think is a bad thing, but I think it's a really good thing because often it creates the spark for creativity. But if it's managed badly, it can become incredibly destructive. So those tend to be my favorite moments.
Yeah. And how has the board evolved over these years that you have been part of, especially with the emerging trends like cybersecurity, digital innovation coming in? How's the board shaped over the years?
Hugely. I think I think the expectations on boards have changed enormously. The process around boards have become more complex. The involvement of stakeholders more complex too. I've recently written something on LinkedIn saying that I think we're in a new phase and we're moving from what I call a maps world to a sat-nav world in terms of board decision making. I think that's the biggest change at the moment. And it's not because of COVID. I think it's been accelerated by COVID. But the idea of the classic strategic Bible and annual budget is being replaced by strategic frameworks, strategic parameters, and dynamic budgeting. So you're making your decisions closer to junctions, but you've also got better information. You've got more live data because of big data and big data analytics. So I think that's quite exciting. I think the rise of next-gen boards, which may be of particular interest to your listeners, is really interesting. And many organizations now, Gucci, Interbrand, Financial Times, EY Foundation, and other things I'm involved in, we've created not just great opportunities for young people to be on those next-gen boards, but also we've created a connection to different generations, which is informing decision-making, informing the choices that we make and making the businesses better.
I think that's very interesting to know. If you want to explain further on the next gen for the speaker, especially for the audience, could you just elaborate more on the next gen board?
Yeah, so if I use the EY Foundation as a good example, so we have a really good board. It's a majority independent board, very diverse, but we also have a youth advisory board. and the chair and the vice chair of the Youth Advisory Board sit on the EY Foundation board. The Youth Advisory Board's role is to keep us alive to what's happening in the space that we're in. We support young people on free school meals and in care to help them get into to work. They give us views on all sorts of things, no matter what we're doing. They do their own projects. They come up with stuff that we would need thinking about, that they think is relevant for the young people that we're working with. And we have young people on our board committees. So we have some on the Audit and Risk Committee, some on the Nominations Committee. And the way that I explain it is that most organisations who do what we do will say they have young people at the heart of everything they do. I say that we have young people at the head and the heart of everything that we do, because they're integrally involved in decision making. So we're just going through a CEO transition at the moment, and young people will be involved in picking our next CEO.
Wow.
So that's how seriously we take it.
I think just broadening the spectrum for people from different age group to work together, I think is also required at board level. And moving further, comparing the developing market, because you are a board member and a chair for a lot of markets, especially in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, and you are also part of in the West. So how do you compare the activities that are going on and the differences that you find between the developing market and the so-called developed market?
So usually when people talk about difference, I always start by thinking, well, what's the same first? And what's the same first is that when it comes to a model of board effectiveness, I think purpose, people, and process really help you to get there. Having clarity of purpose of what the role of the board is, what the role of the exec is, the role of subcommittees is, having everybody aligned and agreed with that purpose is helpful. And that's the same whether you're in Africa or in the Northern Hemisphere. Having the right people working together in the right way, that's kind of the same need. Having the right processes to support all of that, that's the same need. What's different is the context and the cultural differences. So one of the things you have to understand is what are those contextual differences? So in ESSA, for example, which is Education Sub-Saharan Africa, we're working on big systemic problems in African education. We have a virtual operating model. So our board teams, operate virtually in many different African countries. And so that brings about a difference in the context of the way we make decisions, the way we interact with each other. The managing cultural differences, I think Erin Meyer at INSEAD's written a really good book on this, which I refer to in my book, around understanding the cultural differences. And so even though I spend a week a month in Africa, or prior to COVID, and have done for many, many years, every time I get on that plane, I feel excited by the fact I'm going to learn something new about the cultures in the places that I'm going to. And I think having a high degree of humility and asking and learning and getting feedback, because self-awareness, I think, is really critical to operating in different environments. And you can't pretend you're from that culture, but you can try hard to understand that culture and work, find a way to balance your cultural kind of values and your cultural behaviors with those of the people that you're dealing with. So I think respect is huge in making that work. I think there's some real innovation happening in African boards at the moment. I think it's sort of a fallacy to think that all the innovation happens in the north. It doesn't. I think there's lots of interesting things happening.
That sounds interesting, and I think this is good times, especially for African and the developing markets, especially from the board level. And now we are at the final question. What advice, because you have talked about how the new age boards are coming up. So what advice would you give to the millennials and the Gen Z hearing you today that wish to follow your path in social enterprise, especially working in the board level?
I think go for it would be my advice. Try and get yourself on a next gen board, as a trustee on a small charity or a big charity. Try and hook up with people who are really good at being board members and watch and learn. I mean, I was so fortunate with so many people who helped me when I was starting out, and experiment, try different approaches. Try different ways of interacting, try different ways of challenging. Listening is so critical. And when I was sort of at that stage, I used to have a metaphorical pencil because I was so enthusiastic, and I had something to say on every issue, I'm sure. And I just realized, actually, you can't do that. You have to pace yourself. You have to be calm, reflective, responsive, not just react to everything that's said. And I love my mathematical symbols, and I had a normal distribution with effectiveness on the vertical axis and pressure on the horizontal axis. And it's a bell curve. So you're asleep or you're a headless chicken. And I used to think, how do I keep myself in my professional and my family life? How do I keep myself somewhere near the middle and not take on too much, and kind of pace myself? So those would be the things that I would think about. And don't be afraid of rejection. I think it's much healthier to assume you're probably going to get rejected, and if the good thing happens in that situation, that's fantastic. And then you imagine what you could do now as a result of that.
I think this is very fruitful advice, especially for the young generation that go into corporate world thinking they're like in the Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, wanting to do everything. But I think prioritizing and seeing where you can add more value could be one of the things which they can focus on. And this brings us to the end of the session. Thank you for doing this, Patrick. Thank you for doing this. And
absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the viewers, until we meet next time, bye-bye.